Oh my gosh, Cam, thank you so much for joining us again. Everybody loved your last video. It was so much information. There were
Thank
just a couple.
you.
Oh, it was mind blowing. I don't know how you do it because I couldn't do it. There's no way.
Well, I'll always say I'm not a FDA professional by any means. I'm not a lawyer. I don't work in the field. All I am is a person that all I'm doing is really reiterating government regulation and giving my viewpoint, my spin on kind of what I think it means and kind of how it plays into everything today.
I've looked into so many aspects of this, and I've never put one. I don't know, 1/100th of this together or even put it together in a way that would make it like, it's one thing to read the government regulations. This is another thing to be able to read that regulations and put it together for what we're dealing with, which is a situation that's just so unusual.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely.
So the reason why I wanted to bring you on for this segment is that I have heard, and I know that you have heard, just the barrage of disinformation and maybe just people clinging on to hopes and thoughts and prayers of a way around this whole ordeal that we're in. So I put together this little clip of just things that uh, we I pulled from TikTok and just some of the information that's going out there so we can kind of steer people to what the regulations say, not what people are. I'll just play it.
Yes, you are not going to be able to get straight Tirzepatide from your compounder anymore. What they are able to do is they have been waiting and knowing that this moment was coming. So you have to work with your physician to create a kind of like 3-drug combo, right? So you're going to have your Tirzepatide, which is your active ingredient, but they're also going to have to combine it with like a B12 or a niacinamide, which is vitamin B. So you're just getting the active ingredient with a couple of other vitamins mixed into one. So it's not the Mamaro,
a different molecular structure, such as B6 or B12.
Here's what's going to happen. Compounding pharmacies know that this is eventually going to happen, and they have already been testing different combinations of compounded medications that include different vitamins that are going to get them around the patent issues and the licensing issues when it.
So some prescribers might prescribe that their patient needs B12 or B6 mixed with it, or possibly varying dosages.
So what you'll most likely see is compounding pharmacies start putting B vitamins in their formula. You may see a drop of B6 or B12, and it's probably going to be so minute that you won't even notice a difference. However, it will get them around the patent and license issues.
So B6 helps with nausea, B12 helps with fatigue. Those both provide benefits to patients that the original does not have.
He's been feeling a little tired, a little B12 might help here, this and this. So we can actually use these reasonings to get, if you're using your insurance in helping to get coverage for these medications, to document why you might need a shot of B12 or a little bit of vitamin B, all the good things.
Even if I'm wrong about that, people that I trust that are in the business and have vested interest in the business have assured me that there are accommodations and things that will step in and take care of those of us that would just be hung out to dry.
That's my favorite line, hung out to dry. Well,
Hung out to
the
dry.
first rule in alleged crime club is telling everybody the plan.
Right. Yeah. It's yeah. There's so much to unpack there. Um, and yeah, there's a lot that's being said and on lives and on TikTok and various social media platforms, and people don't understand the validity of what they're saying. But to explain that, I think we first have to understand kind of where the regulation, comes from. So, with regards to that, everything that I'm talking to, at least in this specific segment, is in regards to 503A compounding pharmacies. And I'm pulling this information from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, 21 USC 353A. And there's two guidances that fall under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the FD&C Act. And those are going to be the first document being compounded drug products that are essentially copies of a commercially available drug product under Section 503A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And the second guidance that I'm going to be referring to is the pharmacy compounding of human drug products under Section 503A of the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. So essentially, what they're trying to do is they're trying to find a way, and let me say this, when I say they, I'm not referring to any affiliates or really the people making these videos or anything like that. I'm referring to the compound pharmacies and the telehealths and the lawyers that are associated. Once again, this is based off of my beliefs. I believe they are trying to find a way around the 503A exemption. There are certain requirements that you have to follow under the FD&C Act, Section 503A. Now, when we go back to kind of how we got here, if a drug is on shortage, per the regulation, 503A and 503B pharmacies are allowed to get involved and fill the gap. So,
And that's kind of how we're all operating on this in the first place, is filling a gap because it's been taken off. Is that correct?
correct. So if the drug is on shortage, the compound pharmacies can get in there and they can go ahead and make essentially what we know as a copy of the drug. That is why when you go to a compound pharmacy, you're ordering Tirzepatide, Semaglutide, whichever one you're getting, you're still getting it in the strengths of 2.5, 5 milligrams, 7.5, and then less familiar with the dosaging strengths for Semaglutide. But normally they follow in line with the name brand amounts that you would get if you weren't using compound, right?
Right.
So it literally is to fill the void because the name brand isn't available due to shortage. So with that being said, that has carried us up to this point. As we all know, on October 2nd, it was determined, the FDA determined that Tirzepatide was no longer in shortage. The status went from in shortage to resolved. Once it goes from in shortage to resolved, you no longer fall under the 503A exemption to continue compounding that specific API. That's when everything changed, right? Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a specific list of criteria that you can literally go through to determine if you are allowed to compound a drug or if you're not allowed to compound the drug. And one of the first questions that it asks is, and this is coming from the regulation, is the
It's just wait, hold on.
comparable.
Just to clarify, when you
Yes,
did the rules, is this saying when a drug is not in shortage, or this is during the shortage?
yes. So that's the first question, actually. So the first question of the Appendix A of the document says, is the comparable marketed drug product not commercially available? Meaning, is it either discontinued or is it on the FDA drug shortage list in effect under Section 506E of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act? Now, prior to October 2nd, the answer to that was yes. If it is yes, then you are allowed to compound under Section 503A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, provided that all the rest of the conditions are met. Okay. However, post October 2nd, that answer is now no. So then we go to Section 503A B1D. And the second question is,
Wait, hold on.
is
So
the,
on that
sorry,
date, the October 2nd, so that changed the rules to that the 503A, is that the A had to stop that day and then the
correct.
B could carry on?
But yes, that is
So
correct.
that's why people are for a lot of the reputable telehealth companies. So that's why they're still able to place their orders until I think it's what they say. I heard on TikTok it was December 4th.
It's just whatever 60 days is. I'm not sure where that falls on the
So
calendar.
like
I don't think,
about like to October, November,
yes.
December.
So that sounds
So
about
that's
October.
how
And
they're operating under that. Okay, that clarifies that for me. Sorry about
yes, so that's how they're operating under that one. So going back to the 503A, so if it's not in shortage, you move on to the next question. The second part, which is per Section 503A B1D, is the compounded drug product essentially a copy? And I want to take a second to really hone in on this because this is where all of these B12, sublingual, dosage strengths, This is where everyone's caught up at, and this is where everyone's currently trying to find a workaround, okay?
Okay.
You have two designations. Either the compounded drug is a copy or it's not a copy, okay? If it is a copy and the drug is not in shortage and it is not discontinued, you are not supposed to compound it, okay? So, the only times when you can compound a drug that is essentially a copy of the name brand is when it is unavailable due to shortage or discontinuation, right? So now, what everyone is trying to do is they're trying to make an argument for why their version of Tirzepatide is not the same as the commercially available name brand product. Okay? Now, there are three stipulations that the regulation defines to determine whether or not it is or isn't a copy. And we're going to dive into each one of these. The first one is, and this is from the regulation, does the compounded drug have the same active pharmaceutical ingredients, API, as the commercially available drug? That's one. The second one, does the API have the same, similar, or an easily substitutable dosage strength? And the third one, does the commercially available drug product, oh, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Can the commercially available drug product be used by the same route of administration as prescribed for the compounded drug? If the answer to one of those three is a no, then technically the drug may be compounded under Section 503A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, once again, if all of the conditions are met. However, the problem these telehealths, med spas, pharmacies, etc. are going to have is being able to prove that one of these entities does not apply. So let's get in, and this is also where you start to hear all of the craziness that has everyone confused on the internet. Let's talk about the first condition that people are going to try to get around on, and
Yeah,
that is
the
the same
API.
API.
So that would
Correct.
be where, like, oh, if I just add vitamin B6 or B12 because I have nausea and that helps with that, then we're changing the API, right?
From how this document reads, that doesn't even have anything to do with the API because vitamin B12 is its own API.
Well, there's that.
When you fact check me on that, you can fact check me on
No.
that. But from what I'm understanding, vitamin B12 is its own API. So you can't really use one API to change another API to say that you're changing the API. I'm not, and that's why I'm not really understanding where that thought process came from based on the regulation. But here's what the regulation does say. So the first thing they have to try to find a way around, the first option that they have to try to maneuver a way around is going to be trying to prove that it does not have the same API, which it absolutely does. Now, I know that there's been a lot of talk about adding B12 or some other vitamin to it, but adding B12, from my understanding, which I'm not a scientist, but that doesn't necessarily make it to where you're not using, like, it doesn't change the API. You're still using Tirzepatide, which is a patented API. You're just adding another API to it known as B12. That goes into a whole different section of the regulation, which is section D, which talks about having the same characteristics as two or more commercially available drug products. And that goes into adding the same APIs as two or more commercially available drug products. And there's a whole nother rule set of that. Just because you're adding one API, which is vitamin B12, to another API, which is Tirzepatide, does not mean that you're not using the same API. Because in order to have the desired effects, you still have to use Tirzepatide, which is a patent protected API. So the same API, there's no way around that one because you have to use the patent protected API. So we can move on from that one.
It's essentially saying if you need the vitamin B12, they make an injection for that. You could take
Correct.
Tirzepatide and B12. You're not essentially taking the two and making a different drug. I kind of think about it as like if I had a medication for my heart and then I needed a medication for, I don't know, acid reflux, I wouldn't go to a compounding pharmacy and request that they make me one pill to treat both things.
Correct. But even if they did, it doesn't get you around the exemption.
Right.
It doesn't get you around the exemption. I mean, if they want to mix B12 and Tirzepatide or Nia minus whatever that is, or whatever they want to add to it, so be it. But that doesn't mean that you're getting around the exemption, because the exemption does not state, well, if you add an API, if you add a secondary API to it, then you're no longer under. That's not what it says. The exemption says if you're using the same API, that is the API that is in the name brand, and you have to use the same one in the name brand. So for that specific one, there's no way around that. So as far as why people are adding, vitamin B12, vitamin B6, whatever they're adding to it, I'm still not understanding the thought process of that getting them around the exemption, because there is nothing here that talks about adding multiple APIs to the API of Tirzepatide being a way to get around the 503A exemption. Per this document, it does not exist.
Yeah, and I kind of fell for it a little bit at first when I first started hearing about this floating around on TikTok and IG and everything. And I was like, "Oh, that's brilliant." It changes essentially. And I, put a little bit of common sense into it. And I said, "Well, why would any company in the world ever spend any money to spend billions of dollars to develop any drug ever if you could simply get around a United States patent by putting a couple drops of vitamin B12 or B6 in it?"
They wouldn't.
They wouldn't.
The next section asks if the compounded drug has the same, similar, or easy substitutable strength to the name brand.
I was thinking about that too. I was like, well, what if someone couldn't tolerate 2.5 to 5? Could they ask for a compound of like 4? Or that I actually had that thought a few times during this whole fiasco as well. So what does that mean? So does the API, so what do they say about that? Could we do that? Could
Yeah.
we make it like a
So
10 or
yeah.
11 or something?
FDA generally intends to consider two drugs to have a similar dosage strength if the dosage strength of the compounded drug is within 10% of the dosage strength of the commercially available drug product. Here's essentially what that means. Let's say that you were on 5 milligrams, right? And you, for whatever reason, had the medical necessity to require, let's see, it has to be 10% or less. So yeah, that you had the medical necessity to require 6 milligrams.
6.
Obviously, 6 milligrams is not available given the traditional ways of which we are able to be prescribed ZepBound, Mounjaro, Tirzepatide through the name brand formula. Essentially, what this is saying is if you have the medical necessity that requires you to need a 6 milligrams, then the compounder can make a 6 milligram and be exempt to Section 503 of the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetics Act. Now, here's the thing. You still have to prove the medical necessity of why you need that strength, and it has to be more than a 10% difference of what the original name brand would have been, okay? So then, yes, you can compound it in that specific scenario. That also has to be proven for each individual patient. So what you're going to hear a lot of is you're going to hear of a lot of telehealth companies and a lot of compounding pharmacies trying to essentially provide options that are outside of the normal dosing schedule of the name brand equivalent. And the purpose for that is because they are trying to use the same, similar, or easy substitutable strength section of this document as a reason to get around the 503A exemption and continue compounding, right? However, there's going to be some big issues with trying to prove this because, like I said, you have to prove the medical necessity for each individual patient. How this document is written, you cannot offer 6 milligrams to people as a way to circumvent federal law because you have not established that that specific individual actually has a need for a strength level outside of the recommended dosage strengths that were approved in the clinical trials. And what they're also going to have a hard time proving is why suddenly, post October 2nd, a large majority of your patients now require uh, this customizable strength level that differentiates outside of the strength levels that were proven and approved through the clinical trials. And there's a lot of, let me pull up my document here. There's a lot of companies that are going to try this, and I have one specifically here.
And I think also too, pulling in there after October 2nd, you have hundreds of thousands of people that all of a sudden have all this extreme nausea they didn't have, and they're all the way up to dosage 15, and they're tolerating stuff that has never been reported. So all this, everybody's side effects can't start on October 3rd.
Correct. Even with side effects, all you're doing is still adding another API to a patented API.
Right.
So it still doesn't get you around the exemption.
Right, and then you can't have 100,000 people that all of a sudden need a dose that they've been on for months, and now all of a sudden there's a new reaction.
Absolutely not. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but to me, that sounds like fraud.
Yeah.
I mean, you all of a sudden, post October 2nd, all of your patients have the same medical necessity or have the same side effects that require them to have a compounded medication outside of the name brand. How are you going to prove that? How do you even have the medical documentation to even prove that? In regards to the same, similar, easy substitutable strength, there are a lot of companies that are going to be trying this. There is an article by Politico by Lauren Gardner and David Lim, came out September 27th. And one of the things they said in the article was Dr. Pat Carroll, who is the chief medical officer for the telehealth platform HIMSS, he said that his company is focusing on specialized dosing. And it says in the article, they consider the specialized dosing for products whose doses fall between two FDA-approved dosage levels. So once again, between 5 and 7.5, as a way to appeal to patients who want to slowly increase the amount of the drug they take. Okay, that's great. But once again, where's your medical necessity? And I think that the medical necessity portion of this document is what a lot of people are failing to understand. So the document states
What
that,
about the part in the rules where it said something about changing the dosages, and it gave reference to the injectable? Wasn't there a specific line in there about the injectable, so you could just simply draw a smaller amount out of a vial?
let me see here.
Like, trying to find.
No, so right, so yeah, so there's nothing. There's so you're referring to the route of administration. That was the example they used for the route of administration, but it wasn't in regards to dosage levels. It was in regards to literally intramuscular versus subcutaneous was the example that they used. But there was an example within the guidance that talks about if you have FDA approved drug X that has a dosage strength of 25 milligrams, but then a patient needs 50 milligrams, the patient can take 2 of the 25 milligrams of the name brand. And so you can't create a dosage you can't compound a dosage of 50 milligrams because it doesn't exist. Because technically they can take 2 of the name brand and get the same effect as the 50 milligram. So you can't compound the 50 milligram if you are able to take 2 doses of a 25 milligram that is available on name brand. Now, here's kind of, I guess, where that could play in. So let's go back to the example of the 5 milligram and the patient that needs 6 milligrams. Here's where this could get kind of tricky. You got 5 milligrams of ZepBound Manjaro, right? Your patient needs 6. No, 6 milligrams does not exist in a pen, but it can be created out of a pen and a vial. You have to remember, we have the 2.5 and the 5 milligram vials.
We released
So
the vials.
whatever dosage you need between 5 to 7.5, 7.5 to 10, etc., that can be achieved with another 2.5 vial.
Oh,
Now, whether or not that is on Eli Lilly's, radar or plan, or whether that would even be able to be done with, their amount of resources, I don't know. But that is a valuable argument. Like I said, there's people out here that are going to try to do customizable dosage strengths, but the rule is if the name brand can achieve the same customizable dosage strength, then essentially the compound is a copy of the commercially available drug product. And in order to get around the exemption, it cannot be a copy of the commercially available drug product.
and because we've released the vials, we literally have made every dosage combination available to man, because no matter how you could split up a 2.5 milligram vial or a 5 milligram vial and make any strength of combination just simply by prescribing a higher dose box and one box of the vials, and the doctor could prescribe that to make your custom dose, whether you can afford it or not. Your insurance covers
Potentially,
it
yeah.
all.
No, I think insurance would be,
Yeah.
I think insurance, that would be a big insurance thing. But technically, could a medical provider prescribe a box of 5 milligram pens and a vial of 2.5 milligram, have them dose it separately in order to make 6 milligrams? Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
Are there other regulations and rules around that? I'm not sure. But not if the issue is having to make sure that you are not producing something that can also be met by the name brand, that's going to be a challenge there.
Yeah.
Because technically you can meet that same requirement of what is the word they use? You can meet that same requirement of specialized dosing with name brand now that we have pens and vials. So, in my unprofessional opinion, in my non-lawyer opinion, that is not going to be a sufficient argument to get you around the exemption. That's number 2 out of 3.
Yeah, because you
And
literally can make any strength with the combination of pens and vials. Every
yeah,
strength, every single strength literally exists.
it literally exists. It literally exists because you only have 2.5 milligrams between each dose. So technically, all you need is a 2.5 milligram vial, and you have every dose that's available between the next strength. And here's the other issue. Let's say you make them a 6 milligram. Let's say the compounding pharmacies were able to get around the exemption and they started doing customizable strengths. As soon as you move up to a strength that was part of the original FDA trial, so the 2.55, 7, etc., you're back into making a copycat drug of a drug that is commercially available. So you would literally have to keep your patients on a milligram strength that is greater than 10% of the approved strength, and you would have to titrate them up and down based off of a very weird formula in order to keep them from getting back, in order to keep them from being less than 10% or at the same amount that has already been previously approved. Because if you're at 6 milligrams and you move them up to 7.5, you're back in violation because now you have compounded a commercially available drug product, because there's no reason, if you're issuing them 7.5 milligrams, there's no reason why they can't go get 7.5 from the name brand. So
Right.
you continuously have to track your patient and make sure that you're prescribing them 10% higher than the recommended strength. And you have to make sure that you keep up with each individual patient that supposedly has this specific medical necessity on a month to month basis.
That spontaneously occurred after October 2nd.
That spontaneously occurred after October 2nd.
Yeah. I don't see any holes in that jury.
No, not at all. So that's all I got time for today, but those are the first two of the three. Then the next one is